Well, 19 minutes before 7. Thanks so much for tuning into Morning Live. The Gauteng Department of Health has reported that an ambulance was broken into and a GPS device stolen yesterday as paramedics were attending to a call in Zola and Soweto. And this followed the vandalizing of ambulances in Alexandra and in Soshanguve, also while paramedics were attending to patients. The Western Cape Health Department reported that there have been at least 12 attacks on EMS personnel in that province since the start of 2020 alone. And medical crews deployed to assist communities have been robbed and pelted with stones in some incidents. The government says that attacking EMS members may result in crews not responding, which would have dire consequences for patients. Now, a fortnight ago, Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga announced that countrywide 1,577 schools had also been rocked by vandalism, theft and break-ins. So to discuss these phenomena, we are joined now via Skype by the General Secretary of the SA Council of Churches, Bishop Malusi Mpumlwana, who is also part of the Ethiopian Episcopal Church. And we also have Stanley Henkeman with us, and he is a director at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Gentlemen, thank you so much and welcome to both of you here on Morning Live.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good morning, and thank you for having us.
Bishop, let me start with you. Firstly, one cannot help but wonder, because the mind boggles, what would cause a community to destroy the very things that are positioned to assist them, such as ambulances and schools?
I think there is a great measure of alienation that is in our society. I may perhaps suggest that there are probably two parts to this. The first one is that, I remember the day Mandela came out of prison in 1990. I was placed in Uprooting. And that afternoon, there was a woman walking down the street shouting, "Mandela is free. I'm going to get a house in town." And a number of people were beginning to say what homes they will occupy in the city. And this is the expression of a poverty-stricken community that thinks that freedom and liberation means accessing certain things. And the reality is that life has not changed very much for many of those people. And that, therefore, the project of freedom and a new South Africa remains an alienated, distant reality for them. And so the idea that I will get something by grabbing, by violating, remains very much part of, in fact, for many, the political freedom, not to mention economic freedom, the political freedom itself became something for some people and not for all. As you can see what's happening in the political elite and the way things are conducted. So that's just one. The other aspect probably needs more research by psychologists. Because I remember that Professor Tabani Manganyi, in his little reader that he published in 1973, Being Black in the World, talked about the experience of trauma in our society and how, in fact, we needed, he said, to have what you might call barefoot psychologists in the communities to help people deal with the experience of trauma that they tend to transfer out to others. And there's a study done by I think Levy and others that talks about how trauma has the effect of combining things in a way that defines how people react to their reality. So there is a sense in which the traumatic problem that we have, which results in killing your very own, attacking your very own. It is not unrelated to all time that we see. But I think that these objects of help almost say, I don't deserve this, I will take it down.
And one then has to, again, as you say, Bishop, interrogate just the logic behind that type of rationale. But if I can bring Stanley Henkeman in, if we look at this, some would argue that these are pure acts of criminality. Would you agree with that, or do you believe that that is perhaps just too simplified a version to contextualize what is actually happening at the moment?
So on the face of it, what we see is can be construed as acts of criminality. It is a kind of total devaluation and disregard for property, public property, people. But it is simplistic. You know, our situation is so much more complex. And I think the bishop has put his finger on it when he spoke about the fact that we are a deeply traumatized and wounded society. And you know, you're talking about hundreds of years of shame, of exclusion, poverty, invisibility. And what 1994 did was that it created what I'd like to call a holding pattern, where people kind of thought that these things will come to an end soon because democracy has arrived. There's been a social compact. Bear in mind that the slogan of the ruling party for those elections was a simple but deeply profound one for people, namely a better life for all. And as people started seeing very little change, you know, that shame and the increased poverty, increased invisibility, even by our own, that is something we mustn't forget. And add to that, growing inequality, corruption, and people feel completely let down. And so while one cannot excuse what's going on, see is that you know, it's people acting out of deep disappointment, but it is the trauma coming forward. And so this trauma is then manifested in some of the things we see today. And so how is it then that you can, as you ask, destroy the very things that are supposed to help you to exist in a better way? But you know, when trauma is so deep and so pervasive and so overwhelming, consequences are not immediate considerations. What you do consider is how do I survive? And think of it, schools most likely have computers. These ambulances have equipment that can be sold. And so one cannot just, you know, say that it is wanton criminality. Yes, it is criminal. Yes, it is. It speaks about the moral decay. But you must go back and ask, so what is at the heart of it? And this unresolved trauma has almost been exacerbated by the betrayal of our own people, you know, being corrupt and taking money that could be used for the benefit of people. And so one must not underestimate the deep trauma in our society.
So why haven't we dealt with that deep trauma then, if the results of it are as stark as we are seeing, Bishop Mpumlwana? We look, for example, at cases of gender-based violence, and this appears also to be an entrenched culture. So why haven't we dealt with these traumas, given that the consequences are absolutely unspeakable?
We have not done a healing program at all in any of our socialization areas. It does not matter whether it is at school or at the churches or anywhere. There has been no attention to this, what Stanley is talking about. But I just want to say that I don't see much of a difference between breaking into an ambulance, breaking into a school on the one hand, and breaking into the coffers of the National Fiscus. In fact, the latter is worse. And people see this happening all the time through corruption, connected people and tenders. kind of obscene display of ill-gotten wealth. And that, people look at that and say, what's the difference? And so we have to deal with this at various levels, to deal with the criminal justice system, but it must be equitable. It must cut across. There must be clear consequences for everyone. But at the same time, we need to deal with the deep-seated trauma in our society. And this has to do with what goes into the formation of the South African person. The formation happens in the school. It happens in all the other socialization places that we have to live with. And then, of course, I think that the public broadcaster, such as you have, become an important platform that can also be used to reach people and begin to find a different way. There isn't, Sakina, what you might call a South African identity today. There's no such a thing. There is no common identity of what it means to be South African. There was a time when the South African Pastoral Church was having a conversation with the Luthuli Foundation and the Luthuli family to say, can we take someone like Albert Luthuli and say, can we identify those things that he would frown upon, that this is un-South African, or things that he would have, the ideal South African, and maybe just build this around the persona of Albert Luthuli. We can do this with one more or more people that say, look, these are champions, if you like, the ancestors of the ideal South African. And this is what we should build upon. And maybe a program like that would then begin to bring new value systems. But also we need to accept that there is a need for the home to be, we recognize that the home is no longer the kind of value development institution that it used to be before. First of all, only 38% of South African families have got both parents living with them. And that says that the 62% that do not have both parents living with them are largely supposed to be either a single mother or even child-headed. And so that mother works doubly hard to put food on the table, and there isn't the time for her to be molding these values. So all of these things need attention. We need to find alternatives that support that reality.
We did at some point in this country, Stanley Henkeman, have the moral regeneration movement. Didn't that seek to address the issues that Bishop Mpumlwana answers there in terms of just trying to bring us back, pull us back towards ourselves as a nation, as it were? Why haven't those programs worked? I'm sure it had some effect, but clearly not the kind of effect we're looking for that can shift the kind of behavior we're talking about. And Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And as long as government appoints people to lead things like the moral regeneration, it's a matter again of them wanting to control that process. And I think when you talk about, dealing with this trauma, it has to be a societal thing, and use the people in our society who are equipped for it. Use our religious leaders, use our psychologists, but let's have a concerted effort to ask the question, not how can we change things on the surface, but how can we fundamentally shift things so that our people don't have this level of shame. Because how I respond to you is a direct indication of who I am and the shame that I feel for myself. We have to shift the levels of poverty. We have to shift the fact that people feel invisible, that people feel that they're not heard or listened to. Unless you shift that, you're just going to rearrange the deck chairs. And we're heading for the kind of disaster that is almost too ghastly to contemplate. And while I sound like a prophet of doom, all the indications are that our society is decaying
And can I just say, one place to start, and people, in case we say there's no money, there is 1.6 billion rand sitting in what is called the President's Fund, which is as a result of the TRC process, and that money is supposed to go for reparations. What we need to do is to say, how can we utilize that money for the kind of reparations that will improve people's lives, that will take people away from this victimhood to put them on a path? How can we use that money to shift the way our communities are formulated, the way we engage with each other in terms of genders and so forth? So there are ways of doing it. What I'm wondering is whether there is the political will and whether the government is prepared to say to our religious leaders, to our civil society leaders, to our psychologists and social workers, come alongside, let's do this together.
And I suppose the trust deficit now between the government and the people is also something that would become a factor in terms of how this is distributed. But just as we start to wrap this, Bishop Mpumlwana, how does one get rid of the kinds of behavior, the kinds of entrenched negative cultures that we see in our society today? How could it be uprooted and replaced with creative and more productive approaches?
I think I think you said it well when you said that the trust deficit, but also there's a trust deficit with religious organizations. I mean, we have had very unfortunate practices in the name of religion as well, and that does begin to say, who can you trust? And so I think when Stanley is saying it should be a concerted effort, it is not one body or the other, but definitely it's not a government issue by themselves, but it is something that I think that we need to identify socialization institutions, Sakina. There must be, I do not know what is taught at school. I mean, look at the trouble that you see inside the schools, the tension between learners and teachers, the tension between behavior that is expected of school children and what you actually have happening. All of these things are expressions of the trauma that we're talking about. And that therefore there has to be some program that looks, I think that maybe one of the things we can do, I mean, is to say, let's have a conversation about how to develop such a program so that the money that Stanley is talking about can be much more targeted.
And Stanley, you have the final word on this in terms of how do we uproot and deal with the anger, the social gaps that exist, the disgruntlement, and in some instances, the pure criminality that has taken root in our societies. What do we do?
Sakina, I wish I had that simple answer for you, but I think that it's all good and well to bring in legislation and policies and all of that, but that will not shift behavior. That will not shift attitudes, and that's why what we're talking about, and the Bishop has alluded to it, is to have kind of interventions where we, on a consistent basis, start challenging each other about our thinking, about our behavior. But with that, there must be systemic aspects of addressing inequalities, poverty, and these things. And it's not just a one thing. It has to be it's a complex problem, so it needs a solution that has many different arms to it. And we need to have a society that is a country that is more resilient. We need to have a country where the fabric of that society is strong, and particularly where the hopes and the outcomes of future generations are more positive. And in order to get there, we have to seriously realize we have a problem, and to say that government alone. And in fact, government needs to acknowledge that there are people in our country who, not one particular group, who can together work towards a different kind of outcome.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. Bishop Malusi Mpumlwana is the General Secretary of the SA Council of Churches, and Stanley Henkeman is the Director at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, discussing with us a very, very important subject, that of culture and a culture of vandalism and looting, if you were, in the South African context, and what needs to be done to uproot ourselves from this. With that, it's time for news. Leanne standing by with that.